Welcome to Flash Essential Training Series. I'm Mike King, your host, and in this tutorial we're actually going to look at conditional statements in ActionScript 3. We're going to finish up our tutorial on the if statement. This is part 2 of that two-part series. So conditionals in ActionScript 3. In this tutorial we'll continue our discussion on conditional statements in ActionScript 3. We wrap our discussion on the if statement, or we wrap up our discussion on the if statement in ActionScript. We also add to the dynamics of the if statement by looking at the else-if portion of that statement. So the syntax of an if statement, and we went through this in the previous tutorial, we have the if keyword, then we have the expression itself that needs to evaluate to true, and then we have the block of code in between our curly braces that's going to execute if the expression is true. We also looked at the else-if, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. When the Boolean value of the expression is true, the code between the brackets will be executed between those curly braces. Remember, if the expression is not a Boolean expression inside the expression statement, which means the value it returns is not a Boolean value, which is either true or false, then the value of the expression will be auto-converted into a Boolean value by the mechanism called implicit coercion inside of ActionScript. We'll take a look more about that in a future tutorial. The syntax of the if and the else statement, again, we have that if keyword with our expression that needs to evaluate to true, a block of code that executes if it is true. If that's not true, then we go into the else portion of the statement, which has a block of code that will be executed if the expression evaluates to false. So in this particular example, we actually have two blocks of code that execute based on the evaluation of the expression in parentheses. We also have the syntax of an if, else statement, and that is basically we have an if statement with our if keyword and an expression. If that expression evaluates to true, then a block of code is executed. Then we have an else if which actually can hold another expression, and if that expression evaluates to true, then that block of code executes, and if neither one of those evaluates to true, then the else condition executes the block of code inside the else condition. So we actually can have these nested else if statements where we can have multiple expressions, and based on how they evaluate determines which block of code actually evaluates inside that conditional statement. We also have another way of doing this called the switch statement, which we'll look at in a future tutorial. So let's go into our development environment and work through some exercises now that reiterate what we've learned on the if and the else statements inside ActionScript 3. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and drop out of our presentation and get into our development environment. Let me go ahead and open up Flash. I've got my standard branding layer up as we always do. So in this tutorial we're going to continue our discussion of conditional statements and build on what we learned in the previous tutorial on the if statement. In this tutorial we're going to build a logon screen that compares a username and password and reacts to the entries with either a positive response or negative response depending upon the entries that we've actually put into those input fields. We're going to cover some additional concepts in this tutorial as well as the if statement. We're going to examine different operators that can be used with the if statement, such as the AND operator and the OR operator. We're also going to look at a new command that we have not previously used called the URL request inside this tutorial. So let's go ahead and get started. And I'm going to go ahead and change some properties in this one. So I'm actually going to go into my properties panel. With that file selected, I want to give this a width of 200 and a width of 300. Let's give it a width of 300 and a height of 200. I also want to give it a background color of a very light gray, so we're just going to give it a nice little light gray background color. Frames per second are going to be 15 frames per second. My ruler unit is going to be in pixels, which is what we're measuring right there. Then I'm going to go ahead and select frame 1. And I want to go ahead and insert a layer, and I want to name this layer background because that is going to be our background layer. Now I want to go ahead and select the text tool, make sure that my background layer is selected. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as before we get too far into this. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as. Let's go ahead and save this as 1015 underscore example underscore 2. Go ahead and save it as that number 2 file. Now we've got this nice little new background created. I'm going to go ahead and select my background layer, select my text tool. I want to go ahead and set in a static text Arial font. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll up and get my Arial font here. So we've got an Arial font selected. I'm going to go ahead and use a 14-point font. And it's going to be bold, and we're going to use a nice, I'll use white. It should stand up. Actually, you know what? I'm going to use black. Stand up pretty good against that light gray color. And then right up here at the top, I'm just going to type in, please log in. Because this is actually going to become our login form. I'm going to go grab my selection tool and just kind of position that right below our branding for on target HTML5. So now I've got that please log in text. I'm going to go ahead and lock that background layer. Since we won't be putting anything else on there, I'm going to add a layer to the timeline. I'm going to name it label. So right above the background layer, I'm going to insert another layer. I'm going to call it labels. And this is where we're going to put the majority of our stuff on our login form. Then what I want to do is I want to go ahead and do a save as. Let's go ahead and save this as login.fla because this is going to be our login form. So I'm just going to call it login.fla. So now that we've got our login form, I'm going to go ahead and select my labels layer. And using the text logo, I want to go ahead and add the following labels. Again, static text, Arial font, 12 point. So I'm going to grab my text tool. I want to make sure I got static text, Arial font, 12 point this time. This time I want to go ahead and use a yellow font because it's going to stand out really well against that background. And I want to type in two labels. I'm going to type in a username. And that with a colon. Let's go ahead and select my selection tool. I'm just going to go ahead and put that right there. And then right below that, I'm just going to go ahead and type in another one. I'm going to call it password. Because it's actually going to be where we put our input fields to log into this input or to this form. So I've got a username and a password. Not really liking the way they look against that background. I think I'm going to go ahead and, because that yellow just doesn't stand out like I thought it would. Let me go ahead and use a dark blue. That's even better. And I don't want to use a bold font. That's probably part of the problem. There we go. Let's go ahead and use a dark blue. And we'll use a standard regular font. That looks a little bit better. Let's go ahead and save those changes. Now I want to go ahead and lock that labels layer. And I'm going to add another layer to the timeline. And I'm going to label this layer text field. So right above the labels layer, let's go ahead and insert one more layer. And we're going to call this layer text fields. And this is where we're actually going to add some dynamic text fields to our stage. So I want to go ahead and add the following text fields to the text fields layer. I'm going to go ahead and select my text tool again. This time I want to come up under here. I want dynamic text, Arial font, 14 point. So I've got an Arial font, 14 point. I think we're going to go ahead and leave this. Yeah, we're going to leave this as regular. I'm going to go ahead and make the font though white. That should stand up pretty well against this. I want this to be a multi-line because we're actually going to have a response in here. I want to give it a width of 285. So once we actually put this onto our stage, I want to give this a width of 285. I want to give it a height of 38. And you'll see why here in a minute. And then I want to go ahead and position. This is, by the way, non-selectable. This is going to be a non-selectable field, so I don't want them to be able to select this. And the reason being is because I want to make certain that this is strictly for dynamic text. So in my instance name, I'm going to put response underscore txt for my response text. I'm going to go ahead and grab my selection tool. I'm just going to position this across the bottom of my stage. So I've actually got this positioned across the bottom of the stage. Looks pretty good right there. And actually we should be pretty good. I think I want to make this, actually that's good. I think that will be good the way it's sitting right there. All right, one thing I do want to do is I want to go ahead and embed this font before we move on. I'm just going to call it Arial. That is the name of the font. Let's go ahead and embed it. And I'm going to go select all the glyphs so everything's embedded with it. This way we don't have to worry about any errors when we go ahead and test the movie. Now I want to go ahead and select the text tool one more time. I want to get, this one is actually going to be an input text field. And again, Arial font. So I'm looking right here. I'm going to have an Arial font. I want it to be 12 point Arial font. I want this one to go ahead and be black. We're going to actually use a black text for this. It's going to be single line. I want to show the border around the text, so I'm going to go ahead and select that little field right there, show the border around the text, and this is going to have an instance name of username underscore txt. So I'm going to say username underscore txt. And I'm going to place this field right next to the username label on the form. So I'm going to go ahead and select my selection tool, and right next to my username, I'm going to go ahead and place it right there. So it actually gives us a nice little input field for our username. Now I want to do the same thing. I want to select the text tool one more time. I'm actually going to come down right below that, input text again, just like we'd done before. I want a 12-point Arial font. So 12-point Arial font. I'm going to use black single line, show border around the text, just like we had done before. And this one is going to be called password, or PSWD underscore TXT. So we're actually building this little form. I'm going to go ahead and grab this one and place this right next to my password field. Now the one thing I do want to do is I want to go ahead and select both these because I actually want these to align up themselves. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my alignment tool, and I just want these to align on the right, but not to the stage. I actually wanted them to align together, so that's all right. So now I've got them selected. I can actually go in and select these guys and use my arrow keys, keep them lined up, and just bring them next to my two label fields. So now I've got this username and password field. Let's go ahead and save our work. I'm going to go ahead and save this. Again, I'm keeping this as the login.fla file. Now what I do is I want to go ahead and lock the text fields. We've got the text field set up, and actually both the text fields. Now let's confirm that we've got an instance name for both. I got username underscore TXT, and then I have PSWD underscore TXT for my password field, because we'll need those usernames as we start writing our ActionScript 3. Let's go ahead and lock that text fields layer so we don't inadvertently put anything else on there. Now I want to go ahead and add a layer to the timeline right above the text fields, and I'm going to go ahead and call this layer button. So I'm going to come up into here, rename this button. I want to go ahead and select the button layer, and from the components panel, I want to add a button to our stage. So I'm going to go ahead and close in my properties. I want to bring up our components now, and we've actually been in these components panels a couple times before, but now I want to actually drag this button onto my stage, and I'm just going to put this button again. It's in the button layer, right on the stage, right beneath my login and password. We have a lot of different components in Flash that we can use, we can group, and I'm actually going to have a group of tutorials on the components of Flash, because there's a lot of cool things that we can do with these components. So again, we're just actually dragging this button component on the stage. We're going to actually use this in a second. So I want to go ahead and select that button. Let's go ahead and open up our properties panel. The first thing I want to do is give it an instance name, and this is going to be my submit underscore BTN. And I want to go ahead and give it a label, and inside the label I just want to call it submit. And this is what will appear on the label of the button as we go ahead and set these up. So now I've got a nice instance name for that, and I've got my label on it. I want to go ahead and lock that buttons layer, because we're pretty much now, we've got the interface for our login form done. I do want to go ahead and test this movie. I'm going to do a control enter in Windows, command return to Mac, just to make certain I don't have any errors yet with the movie itself that we generated, and we don't. Good, so we've got this nice little login form working, because we're getting ready now to work up to the actions layer, start adding some actions, or ActionScript 3, to this application. I'm going to go ahead and save all our changes. The next thing we're going to do is get ready to start adding some ActionScript to this. All right, so I've got my button layer locked. Let's go ahead and select the button layer, and I'm going to insert another layer right above the button layer, and this is going to be called my actions layer. This is where we're going to actually put all that ActionScript. So I've got my actions layer created. I'm going to select frame 1 of the actions layer. I'm going to go ahead and save the work. Let's go ahead and open up our actions panel. Again, make certain it's frame 1 of the actions layer selected. That's F9 in Windows, or Option F9 in the Mac. We'll open up that actions panel. I've got mine docked on the right hand side of my screen, so when I open it up, it just actually flies out from that right hand side. Yours will come wherever you basically have it docked at. If you have it docked, if you don't have it docked, you can actually dock it by coming up under Window and opening up the Actions panel, and then just positioning it where you want it on your stage or on your application. I actually keep mine docked on that right hand side. Okay, so the first thing I want to do, let's go ahead and add a couple of variables to our application. So I'm going to go ahead and in the beginning of my Actions panel, I'm going to go ahead and declare a variable called user. I'm going to data type it as a string, and in this particular instance, I'm actually going to assign it a value called John. Then right below that, I'm going to create another variable called pass. I'm going to data type that as a string, and I'm going to assign it a value of password. Normally, these would be dynamic variables. We'd actually assign these variables based on input from the user, but for the first demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and set these up with values of John and password. Then I'm going to go ahead and add an event listener, And you should be getting pretty familiar with these event listeners. We've been using these now for quite a few tutorials. But I'm going to take that submit button. Remember, we named the submit button submit_btn. I'm going to add an event listener to it called a mouse event. It's a mouse down, so it's listening for that mouse down event. And then I'm going to run a function called check user. And then inside that function, we're actually going to do a couple of different things. So let's go ahead and grab the code for the function. I'm going to come right down below that event listener, and then I'm going to create my function called check user. And again, listening for that EVT mouse event. Remember, we could have this EVT as anything that we want it to be. I just happen to use EVT because it reminds me of an event. You can name it anything you want. I'm data typing it as void because I'm not expecting any data returns from this particular function. And then I've got a conditional statement inside my function. So what I'm saying is, if the username _txt, and remember, that's the instance name that we gave that username text field, that input text field. So I'm saying if the text that's inside that username _txt text field is equal to user, in other words, does it equal this variable, in this case John, and the password _txt, remember that's the instance name we gave that password input text field. So if the value of that equals the value of the pass variable, which in this case is password, then my response text will be, you are a valid user, you're logged in, else enter a valid username and password. So that response text field that we created, let's go ahead and save these changes. And actually, before we close this up, this would be a great time to pause if you want to go ahead and type this in. All right, now let's talk about this a little more. Remember that response text field that we created right here? This is where we're actually going to generate the response that comes back from this login form. I'm going to go ahead and let me bring this down a little bit. Let me unlock some of these fields. Remember, the response text, so I'm going to go ahead and unlock all these fields. That has an instance name of response _txt. So that's where the response is going to. This has an instance name of pswd _txt for password. And this has an instance name of username _txt for our username entered. So I'm going to go ahead and relock all those fields, go back into my actions panel, select frame 1 of my actions layer, and that's where these values are coming from. So I'm actually looking at the text that's inside the username _txt input text field. I'm looking at the text that's inside the password _txt text field, and I'm comparing those to these two variables. And right now the variables have fixed values. I have a John and a password. And then I'm actually using that response _txt text field to send back information to the user that's trying to log in, whether they've got that correct or whether they don't. If they have it correct, it says you're a valid user, you're logged in. If they don't have it correct, it tells them to enter a valid username and password. Remember, when we use the double equal signs, that's the comparison operator inside of ActionScript. A single equal sign is an assignment operator. A double equal sign is a comparison. So I'm actually comparing this value and that value. I'm comparing this value and that value. A single, assignment, double is equal. And this double ampersand operator tells ActionScript there are two conditions that must be met for this if statement to return a value of true. So this has to be correct, so this has to be true, and this has to be true. That's what the double ampersand sign means. That's an and indicator. So I have double ampersand that says the username has to equal user and the password has to equal pass. Those two values are those two variables. Let's go ahead and save our changes. Now let's go ahead and test this movie. I'm going to go ahead and collapse my ActionScript window. Control Enter in Windows, Command Return on the Mac. So now let's enter something we know is wrong. We know it's John and password, so I'm going to enter Mike and pass. And then I'm going to hit the submit button. It says enter a valid username and password. I don't like that white text, it's not showing up well, so we'll change that in 1 second. So let's go ahead and enter John. And this time let's enter password. Submit. It says you are a valid user, you are logged in. So we know now that if we enter correctly, it logs us in. And if we enter incorrectly, it tells us we have to enter a valid username and password. I want to put the lowercase John in here because I want you to realize that this is case sensitive. So if I use a lowercase j in that John, it's invalid. It is case sensitive when it compares these values. So it's looking for exact matches inside the values. Let's go ahead and change this text. Inside this text field, I'm going to go ahead and unlock these. Select this text right there. Let's go ahead and open up our property because it didn't show up very well. That's the only reason I'm changing it. It really did not show up that well. I'm just going to select a light blue. That should be a little bit better. Save the change. Refresh the browser or test the movie. Control it in Windows, Command Return in the Mac. Hit submit. Enter a valid username and password. Still doesn't show up very well. I guess I'm going to have to go with yellow, like it or not. I tend to use yellow a lot with these light background. Actually, you know what I could do? Instead of using the light background, what I could do is just come in here to the background itself and just make the background a little bit darker. Maybe not quite that dark. There you go. And now our text will look better. I'm just going to change these label names and make these white. And now it will look a little better. Go ahead and save all those changes. Test the movie. Control enter Windows, Command Return in the Mac. There we go. Enter a valid username and password. And if I enter the valid John and password, those actually do work. You're a valid user. You are now logged in. So as we enter correct and incorrect information, the application is working as expected, but there are a few things we need to fix. First, did you notice that we do not see the hand symbol over the button? When I hover over this button, I'm not getting that hand symbol to show me that it's interactive. Now, most people understand that buttons are interactive, but it would be nice if we actually had the hand symbol. So we want that symbol to signify interactivity. Also, when we enter the password, the text is visible in the password box. That's not very good at all. When I actually type this password in, you can actually see the text. So if someone were standing over your shoulder, they could actually see that password. That's not very good either. So we need to fix that. So in the next demonstration, that's what we're going to do. We're going to go and make a couple corrections on this to make this a little bit more application friendly. All right, so let's make a few changes to the code based on what we just talked about. Remember, I want to get that interactivity, so I want to get that hand symbol over my button, and I don't want my text in the password field to be displayed as text. That's kind of silly. So I'm going to go ahead and select frame one of my actions layer. I'm going to open up my actions panel, F9 in Windows, Option F9 in the Mac. And what I want to do is right below where we've actually set up our variables, I'm going to come down and actually put in a couple new fields. So the first thing I want to do, and we'll talk about these as I enter them, I want to have my password underscore text dot display as password set to true. Display as password is a built-in method inside ActionScript 3, and it actually stars out that text. So as I'm entering things into that field, the text is not actually displayed. It displays as a star or a dot. And then actually I want to put the hand cursor over my submit button. So I'm going to go ahead and add the following line right below that. So I'm going to come down right below that and say submit underscore btn dot use hand cursor, and that's equal to true. We've actually used this one before in the past. So let's go ahead and save those changes. Good opportunity for you to pause if you want to go ahead and type those in. So we've assigned the password underscore text field to be acted upon as a password field itself now. This tells ActionScript that when text is entered into that field, the asterisk sign is to be displayed in place of any of the text that's typed in. And then right below the assignment, we've assigned the use hand cursor property to the submit button. And if you remember from an earlier tutorial, that the button mode property is not available for the components. So the only way that we can implement a hand cursor on a button component is to set the use hand cursor property to true. Let's go ahead and save all this work inside of our file. Now I want to go ahead and test the movie. I'm going to go ahead and collapse my ActionScript panel, doing a Control Enter in Windows or a Command Return in the Mac to go ahead and test the movie. Now if I hover over the button, you'll notice I get my hand symbol. If I type in to my text fields, you'll notice now I'm seeing the star symbol instead of text. If I enter the wrong information, it says enter a valid username and password. If I enter the correct information and submit it, it tells me you're a valid user, you are logged into the system. So you can see now that we've actually starred out the text that we're entering into the password field, and we've actually got the hand symbol now appearing over our submit button, which is an important aspect for interactivity for our users. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close the movie. I'm going to go ahead and go back into my actions layer. So I'm going to select frame one of the actions layer, open up my actions panel, So now let's add some additional logic to our code by checking to see if the username or the password is correct individually. This will allow us to give more specific feedback to the user based on the inputs that are given in the text field. So we're going to make a few changes to our code. So again, I'm selecting frame 1 of the actions layer, I'm opening up the actions panel, and I actually want to go into our function, this check user function, and change this conditional statement a little bit. So the first thing you'll notice, I've got an if statement that says if username is equal to user and password is equal to pass, then I give this valid response. And then I come right down and I do an else, but this time I want to do an else if, because we're actually going to get a little bit more specific now about how we respond back. And we know that the else if can have its own conditional statement. So I'm saying else if username underscore txt. So username, and again, we got to spell this correctly. Everything is case sensitive. Notice I'm using camel case underscore txt dot text. And then now I want to look at this, and that's text text, not the abbreviation. If this is equal to user, so now what I'm doing is I'm individually going in and I'm looking if the username underscore txt.text is equal to this user variable. It's going to have its own condition, and my response text is going to be you must enter a valid password. So now I'm saying if I know the username is right, you must enter a valid password, because then my password must not be correct. All right, we'll leave that one like that. Then I'm going to come down right below that, and I'm going to put in another else if. So I'm saying else if, and again, setting up my curly braces. And inside my else if, I've got another conditional. I'm going to open and close my curl or my parentheses, and I'm going to come down here and just go ahead and copy this conditional that I used here, because I can make some slight modifications to it and use it for my next one. So now I'm saying password or pswd underscore txt. So I'm saying password underscore txt.text equal pass. So now we're looking at the password itself instead of the username. And I'm going to go ahead and copy this response text because it's going to be similar. So I'm saying give myself a new set of response text. And that's going to be right here. It's going to say you must enter a valid username, because obviously the password was correct if the password underscore txt equals a pass. And then I got to come down one more time, and now I've actually got my true else statement. Open and closing curly braces, and in this else statement, I'm actually going to put down my response text. So I'm going to come right below that else statement. I'm going to say response text equal, you must be a registered user to log into the website. Please fill out the registration form. So now basically what we're saying is we're actually working through 3 different conditions. Let's go ahead and save all these changes, and then we'll discuss this. Good time to pause if you want to type this in. So now we're actually looking at 3 different conditions. Let's go ahead and talk about what we've entered. We've entered 2 new else if statements. So the first thing I do is I check the user. I'm running my function and I'm saying if the username underscore txt.text equals user and the password equals pass, in other words, that evaluates to true, it's going to log right in here and say, okay, you're a valid user, you're good. If either one of those does not validate true, in other words, if my username is incorrect or my password is incorrect, it's going to drop down to the next condition. It's going to say, is the username equal to user? And if that's correct, then it's going to say, okay, your password must be incorrect. So it's actually going to drop out of the password and tell me that you've entered an invalid password. Because in other words, remember, it looked for both of these and one of these 2 was not correct. That's why it actually got to this else if. So it's looking at the username and saying, okay, if the username is correct, it's got to be the password that's incorrect. And then it drops out and says, well, if the password's correct, then it's got to be the username that's incorrect. And that's how it actually walks through now and determines which one is incorrect. If everything is incorrect, if nothing matched, then it says, okay, you must be a registered user. Then it comes down to the else condition. You must be a registered user to log on to the website. Please fill out the registration form. Let's go ahead and save our work. Let's go ahead and test the movie, because we've actually entered some pretty complex logic compared to where we are in our training. I'm going to go ahead and do a Control Enter in Windows or a Command Return in the Mac. Now let's enter a wrong username but a correct password. So I entered a username of Mike and a password, so I know the password's correct, but the username's wrong. And it says you must enter a valid username. So let's enter the correct username. So I'm going to enter John. We know that's the correct username, but I'm going to enter an invalid password. This time I entered pass, P-A-S-S. Submit. You must enter a valid password. And if I put in both and hit submit, now it says you're a valid user, you're logged in. If they're both incorrect, so let's enter Mike and pass. We know that neither one of those are correct. You must be a registered user to log onto the website. Please fill out the registration form. So we know that all our logic's working correctly as we've set it up. And it's very important as you're building these applications, especially when you're using multiple conditional statements inside your applications, make certain you thoroughly test them. That is extremely important. So we've performed multiple logins, we've tested all the different variations of this login form, and we know that our logic is working as we've set it up to work. So let's perform one additional piece of functionality with our application before we wrap up this tutorial. So when the user gets a valid login, let's redirect the user to the actual website so that we know that he's actually logged in, he's got a valid username, he's got a valid password, and we're actually going to redirect him to a portion of a real website. So I'll show you how in Flash, how in ActionScript 3, you can actually use a URL request to actually redirect someone from your application back to a website. So we're about to cover something we've not covered in any previous tutorials. It's some very interesting code in ActionScript 3. Keep in mind the code we're about to enter has many functions associated with it. If you actually did the Creating XML Quizzes, which is one of the applications I have in the feature tutorial set for OnTarget HTML5, you've actually seen this request used before as we bring in XML data. Well, in this particular case, I'm actually going to use it to redirect to a particular URL. So what I want to do is let's go ahead and make a few changes to go ahead and complete this tutorial. I'm going to go ahead and close out this movie. Let's select frame 1 of my actions layer and open up my actions panel, F9 in Windows or Option F9 in the Macintosh. And up right below my variables, I want to go ahead and add another variable. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy this in. I'll give you time to type this in a moment. I'm going to come right below that password variable, and I'm going to put in a variable called link. It's going to be data typed as a URL request. It's going to be equal to a new URL request, and it's actually going to forward this to my forums section of the OnTarget HTML5 website. You can actually see I've got the full, couldn't say full there for a minute, I've got the full URL inside my HTTPS, which is part of my URL request, and you'll notice I've assigned that a variable link. So whenever I call this link variable, I'm actually calling this path to that particular portion of my website. Now, in order to get this and have it working the way we want it to work, we actually have to trigger this when the username and password are correct. So right inside of our conditional statement, right where I check and I make certain that my username and password are correct, I'm actually going to add another line of code into that conditional statement. I'm going to come right below the response text, and I'm going to say navigate to URL, and I'm going to call that link variable, which is actually going to call that URL to the OnTarget HTML5 forums link. So let's go ahead and save these changes. So what we've done here is we've created a variable called link. I've data typed it as a URL request, and that's equal to a new URL request, and then I've given it the full path to that particular link that I want to go to in the website. Then inside my function, my check user function, when I have a valid username and a valid password, I'm going to display the response text, you're a valid user and you're logged in, and then I'm going to navigate to that particular website page. And again, I'm just trying to show you that ActionScript has a lot of different things that we can do inside of it. Let's go ahead and save all those changes. I want to go ahead and test this movie, Control Enter in Windows or Command Return in the Macintosh. And you'll notice now we've got our login form. Let's go ahead and type in some invalid data so we can make sure that our logic's working. So I'll type in Mike and I'll type in pass. We know that the username and the password are incorrect in this particular instance. And it tells me we must be a registered user to log into the website. Please fill out the registration form. Now we haven't created a registration form for our demonstration, but that's what we would have to do. Now let's type in a valid username and an invalid password. Hit the submit button, and it says you must enter a valid password. So it knows the username's correct, but it also knows the password's incorrect. Now let's type an invalid username and a valid password. Submit, and it tells me I've got to enter a valid username. So again, it knows that the password's correct, but it also knows the username is incorrect. Now let's go ahead and do both. Let's get them both correct. So type in our John username and type in password for our password. And remember, we're getting these variables or these values from the variables that we created. Now when I submit this button, I should get my response text telling me that I'm good, and it should also redirect me now to that page inside the URL request. And you'll notice it does, boom. It takes me back in. If we could have actually stopped it quick enough, you would have seen that we actually got valid response text, and it takes me right to that website based on the URL request that we actually put into our ActionScript code. So it's taking me right to this location once I get a valid URL request. Very cool stuff that we can do inside of ActionScript 3 and multiple uses of these conditional statements. So I hope you enjoyed this two-part series on the if statement. We actually covered the if, the else if, and the else. In the next tutorial, we're going to build on conditional statements even a little further. We're going to cover what's called the switch statement in ActionScript 3. It's a very, very cool statement. It's when we start getting a whole lot of else ifs, there's a lot better ways to do that. And one of those ways is using a switch statement in ActionScript 3. That's going to be the one we cover in our next tutorial.